So thanks again, Peter, for being part of this, for sharing your expertise and your thoughts during this meetup. And we look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you, Jeff. And it's an honor to be here. It's actually rather fortunate I am, because I never do anything on a Saturday, and I'd had a busy day coaching my son's football team and had to run out and do all the shopping as well because my wife's out with friends, and was just settling down to watch the kind of TV with my youngest, who's 10. And I was just checking my phone, and there was an email from Vasilios saying, looking forward to seeing you at the talk. And I was kind of, oh my God, I'd completely forgotten it was 5 to 7. So I kind of rushed upstairs and just composing myself to do this. But thank you, Vasilios, for the cosmic synchronicity, for putting that prompt on my path just in time to get me here. So yeah, honored to be here with ICRL. And I was thinking about what was great about being able to do this talk here with all of you is that you're all familiar basically with all of the kind of content and the perspective, and often for some reason my role in life has ended up being a bit of a bridge between sectors, between mainstream and new thinking, and trying to help people understand things in ways that don't feel woo-woo and strange, but try to make them as normal as possible. And obviously the pair work has been really useful for that, to be able to say 28 years of research, Princeton engineering department, and you know, had a room full of bankers, 100 bankers, ethical bankers apparently, from Triodos Bank, trying to shift the line on the screen with the Siler on there. And they did actually, they shifted it very statistically significantly, but just the opposite way that they wanted it to go. So it kind of plummeted down when they were trying to make it all go up. But so you know, there were many different things I could have touched on or talked about. And the thing I've chosen to share is a particular practice that I learned over here in the Netherlands through a 4-year vocational training that is actually recognized by the Dutch government in what is now called eco-intention. And because it's really been a bit of a secret over here in the Netherlands and Germany for the last 25 years or so, and it's been part of my mission to take it into the English-speaking world, simply because it works, which probably won't surprise any of us. But does surprise a lot of people, because I think as a lot of us know, it's when you're not used to hearing things from this perspective, then it's hard to believe that these kind of things, approaches can work. And so I'm going to share with you the story of eco-intention, this practice, the way it works. And what I'm really interested in, particularly from this community, is how you see this story, these labels, this language reflected in the work that you do. So it feels like many of us are coming from different perspectives, exploring the same thing, and the innovators in these worlds see the same thing, but we don't think anybody else, or haven't found anybody else who seems to be doing it. And so we create our own language and our own labels around it. And so I'd be fascinated to hear your perspectives on this eco-intention work and what you think is going on, what you understand to be going on based on your experience and language and frameworks that you work with. So really great to be able to share this with this audience. All right. So I'm going to share my screen here. Let me get into presentation mode. So yeah, the reason I got into this and chose to start to learn more about it was because a lot of the work I've been doing was with multi-stakeholders around before the Sustainable Development Goals, that were the Millennium Development Goals, trying to work with them to solve complex problems. And was working, I would set up an organization here called the Center for Human Emergence, very inspired by Ken Wilber's integral theory and the spiral dynamics work with Dr. Don Beck, and we were doing what we call mesh working, which was a way to facilitate collaboration between multiple stakeholders to try to achieve, positive social, environmental goals, etc. And we were busy on this project, which was around maternal and newborn health with 20 different organizations. And we were getting traction, but at some point we just sat down with each other and we're going, it's like we're trying to match complexity with complexity. And there must be an easier way to do this. And we had in our shared frameworks, the spiral dynamics framework. And so we was kind of addressing it from this integral approach, this yellow in spiral dynamics system approach. But there's one beyond that, which is what they call the turquoise or holistic value system. We were kind of, I wonder if that's the simplicity beyond this complexity. What is that turquoise holistic value system about? And a lot of it, in the way it's described, is around energetics and interconnected fields and those kind of things. And it turned out, as we went around the circle, that each of us secretly had been involved in some kind of energy work. There were either people doing healing work. I was into geomancy and my kind of earth energies, and my bookshelf was growing, and obviously the kind of Lynn McTaggart stuff and all sorts of other things. And so we kind of decided that maybe we should lean into what that might be. If we could find some simplicity the other side of the complexity, then maybe we could help solve these challenges more effectively. And that was when, as life does, I got introduced to Hans Anderweg, who was doing this eco-intention work, which was then called ecotherapy. And when I heard about it, I was, oh, okay, so this is working with like kind of, like a Reiki person might work with the individual body and system and their energy fields, information fields. This is working with the energetic information fields of large scale systems. So large areas of land, organizations, things like that. And that's always been what I've been drawn to for some reason, is the collective. I've never done one-on-one coaching much, or one-on-one healing work. Or my path has for some reason been the collective. So when I discovered this, I was kind of very enthusiastic and went through this whole 4-year training process, because I had the sense that it was a way, if we were able to use this effectively, it would help us solve the complex challenges we're facing more gracefully, essentially. So this is, when I kind of start off these talks to folks who maybe aren't familiar with this domain, so I'd be interested in your feedback later in terms of, how you communicate these concepts. As I often say to people, well, we're all familiar with the light spectrum, and we accept that there's part of that light spectrum we can see, and we accept that either side of the visible light spectrum there's a bunch of stuff we can't see. So I say, well, basically it's the same with information. There's a central bit of this information spectrum we can see, where it's dense enough or coherent enough to be visible in the material world that we see around us. But then that spectrum extends outwards, and the information is less gross, more subtle, but is part of the same spectrum, essentially. And so what we're learning to do with something like eco-intention is to work with a broader spectrum of the information fields than we normally see with our eyes and our other senses, because it's when we work with those fields, we're able to increase the probability that a certain reality is going to manifest. Obviously, there's no certainties, it's not linear. You can't talk about cause and effect in that way, in those dimensions, but what does seem to be going on is an increased probability of the purpose being achieved. So, that's how I'd frame it. And another part of the language that I started to use, because my work up until I was doing this energetic work was kind of organizational consulting. And the first two rings there, the material architecture, is what business often focuses on, is the business results, the systems, structures, processes. And then where the consulting world went for a long time was into what I called the relational architecture, with things like the art of hosting and theory U, and a kind of understanding and discovery that if you got the relationships between the people right and flowing effectively in organizations, then the material architecture looked after itself far more effectively. So you got better business results, etc. And I'd done that, and I'd worked in business unit in IBM for 2 years and turned it around. So we had 97% employee satisfaction and triple-digit growth. So I'd kind of proved that we could do it using this relational approach. And then when I discovered this energetic work, as I would call it, I added this layer that I described as the energetic architecture. And now that, you can't see the field of relationship between people. Likewise, you can't see the energetic architecture of the system as a whole, and it's a step more subtle, let's say, than the relational architecture. So my thesis was, well, if we can get that energetic architecture coherent, then the relational architecture will resolve itself far more gracefully, and the material architecture as well. And that doesn't mean you don't have to do the work on the relationships in the organizations and the systems. It doesn't mean you don't have to do the work at the material level, have your business plan and do everything else you need to do to deliver your product or service or whatever it is. But what seems to happen is that it all flows far more gracefully, and you increase the chances of achieving your goals while maintaining a good working environment and health of the people in it. So the language that is used in eco-intention, and this was really developed by two people, a man and a woman, Hans Anderweg, who is Dutch, and Rijk Bols, who is Dutch, but who worked initially in Germany with a baroness who lived in a castle and was doing, kind of based on radionics, was doing distance healing of forests and things, which we'll come to in a minute. But Hans and Rijk left her at some point because they felt a need to take it out more into the world, because all the journals were refusing to publish their findings, which a lot of us here will be familiar with. They thought the only way they could really communicate this was by teaching other people how to do it. And they talk about, they kind of image they use as these two triangles, where the blue is more, you could say, the energetic architecture or the information fields, and the red is the material. And when they're separated like this, the potential of the system to realize its goal is, is not being fulfilled, because you haven't got the full penetration of those two dimensions of its reality. So that's the kind of healing picture. Once they interlock, then you've got the system as a whole system. So it's got its subtle fields fully integrated into its material fields, or the subtle into the gross, you could say, and should be working pretty well. Now, as we all know, that stability in a system or organization lasts for a while, but then either the world changes or things internally in the organization change, and that fit is no longer as strong as it was. So something needs to evolve again. And at that point, the could say the information field, so more information or consciousness is coming in, and that pushes through the limits of the existing material system to give you transformation. And as you know, this symbol, the kind of Star of David symbol, is used in a lot of traditions as a sacred symbol. So from healing to whole to holy, and I'm sure we all know that the word heal is originally the same as the word whole. In fact, in Dutch, it's still exactly the same. Heel is the Dutch word for whole, and helen is to heal, to make whole. And heilig is holy. But what happens then is essentially you start all over again, because as you see, if you just take the dotted lines triangle, then you're back to phase one, healing on the left, where the system has opened up to greater potential, greater information, greater possibility, a bigger vision, but hasn't yet developed the material or gross architecture and systems and structures, etc., to be able to carry and hold that new information and actually manifest it in the 3D world. So then you go through this process again, and on it goes. So essentially, the eco-intention process is the process of helping systems move from that through that phase of healing into becoming whole, where they're fulfilling their purpose, and then facilitating, if the system is ready for it, a transformation to its next phase of being. Just a little bit on the history. On the history here. Move my bar here. So, yeah, it came out of work with radionics and what they called resonance therapy back then. So when they were working in Germany, they were actually using the radionics machines. They were getting quite some interest in Europe, particularly actually in Eastern Europe as well. And this was an example from Park Luxembourg in Austria that went through a 4-year balancing process using the radionics equipment. They had an independent scientific institute come in and review it, commissioned by the government to actually measure the effect. And they came back and reported a 21% increase in the vitality of the area of the park that was balanced compared to the pilot plot, as it were, the test plot next to it. So they were getting, very strong results. As I said, they were having problems getting it published because, of course, it didn't kind of fit the mainstream story of how things work. This was a project in Russia that they worked on with Mikhail Gorbachev on a big park in the west of the Soviet Union, which they had the kind of Soviet, Institute of Science come and measure it, and they had the same results, basically increase in the vitality of the ecosystem of the areas that were balanced compared to the areas that weren't. So they were getting all these great results out in Eastern Europe in particular. They were also balancing large estates in the UK and Scotland. So it was mainly nature-based to start with. And then when Hans and Reich left the ivory tower, as it were, of this baroness in Germany, they started teaching it to others. And the first people who were interested were farmers, because they were finding with this approach that the vitality of their crops was increasing, vitality of the animals, they needed less chemicals, that the farmer themselves needed less time to make things happen, they had a more relaxed life. And around that time, the organizational development people started showing up and realizing that they could probably use this for organizations as well. And this is just an example of, this is the basic kind of evaluation that they do with every project, and consistently find statistically significant results in terms of how the people in the organization report the progress over 4 different time periods of the balancing of the project. And it takes, normally it's about, and I'll go into more detail in a minute, but the initial balancing phase is around 8 months or so. And then there is an integration phase of about 3 months. The first phase, the balancing phase, is where you're working with the system to get it to the target values of the system as a whole. And then the integration phase is where all the subsystems need to come into alignment with the system as a whole. And I'll explain a bit more about that in a sec. So this is another image that we use a lot in the eco-intention, this wheel. The idea being that as we look to, and this is the same, the blue and the red, right? So the blue being the energetic architecture or the subtle information fields, we work to access that. Obviously, we have to use more our intuition or the right brain and learn to access our inner world. So therefore, a big part of the training is also kind of psychic hygiene stuff, quieting your rational mind, mindfulness work, those kind of things, to be able to work consciously with that energetic architecture. And then as it comes into form, it then spins out, as it were, with the red line into the material architecture, manifestation, and focused on the outer world. And so the practitioner essentially aims to sit at the center of that wheel. And that's what you coach the stewards of the system. So the person who's ultimately accountable for that organization or park or nature area, whatever it is, to be able to sit at the center of the wheel. This is in a way the same image, but from a side view. What Hans and Reich started to realize is it started to look like a torus, that you had things coming in through the information fields, and then being manifested out into the material world. That manifestation process left an imprint in the fields that comes back as you attempt to create the next stage, as it were. So it's kind of the karma, I guess, of the system as a whole. And so part of what you learn to do is also transform past patterns in the system, of course, which also reflect in the guardians or stewards of those systems. So there is a coaching part of it as well, where you're working with the individual ultimately accountable for the system as a whole to process those patterns themselves that you see coming back in the organization as a whole. So that desire to take a step into the future is linked to having to resolve or unlock energy that's held in the past. And that's something that informed a lot my PhD research into what I ended up calling volution theory, which I'll come to in a sec. So yeah, if you look at this from the top, it starts to look like a torus. So that'll be a shape and a dynamic, I think, that a lot of us are familiar with in terms of a way of describing the way things work. So this is drawing from my PhD research, where I had the sense that what kind of triggered it is that I'd spent a lot of time in the kind of Wilber spiral dynamics world, which was looking at developmental psychology, stages of development, and starting to feel that a lot of it was too linear in the way it described the way things work. But also particularly inspired by some research I did with a dancer and choreographer, with hundreds of dancers exploring the different value systems and noticing that there were relationships between the higher levels, more complex levels, and the earlier levels that weren't reflected in the linear developmental models that we were often working with. And the other image that was there in my mind as I was kind of lining up this PhD was this image of the torus. And it seemed to me kind of where I ended up was that essentially you've got a creative tension field between the present and a seed and the potential time-wise in the future. So it's like an ecology where a niche emerges, so a need emerges that has to be filled. That sets up a tension field that starts to pull the unified field into a toroidal dynamic, a breathing kind of in and out of the subtle information fields flowing in towards the material, those waves, as it were, coming into greater coherence and increased probability that something's going to manifest at the in the material realm. And it seems to be, and maybe some of you also have more insight in this, that there's a plane shift from the subtle fields that when things click into the material, that they seem to come in at a 90-degree plane. So as you look at the galaxies, for example, you've got this kind of plane there, and you may have seen the kind of NASA images. I don't think I've got one in this presentation, but of the bulbs of gas that seem to be kind of above and below that 90-degree plane. That looks very much like this toroidal dynamic. So the way I framed it, and I'm not going to go into detail on the kind of evolution theory at the moment, was that there seemed to be three core elements to this process. One is the container that is the boundary defined of the entity. And this is really important in the eco-intention work, getting both the name of the entity clear of the project, as well as if there are physical boundaries in terms of a parkland or an organization, really clear on what's the container. and what's its in time, that's in space, and then in time, what its purpose is in terms of what it's wanting to achieve within, for example, a year. And the way I'd often talk about that to people is like, if you go to a doctor for a checkup and you say, how am I doing? They'll look at you and go, yeah, doing all right. And then if you say, and I want to climb Mount Everest in 6 months, they'll probably give you a different report. So you to get the initial energetic scan of the system, you have to locate it in time and space, which is defining the boundary of the entity in terms of, its name, if there is a geographical boundary to it, that, and its goals that it's trying to achieve. And then so you've got that container, and you've got and that's its potential in a way. It's like the field of potential of that entity. And then you've got the manifest level, where things come into being. And then you've got the dynamics between the two. So in evolution theory, I map that trinity to all the kind of religions and the wisdom traditions, and say, look, this is basically the core trinity that all of these traditions are describing as the process of the creation of life, from the kind of causal into the subtle, into the gross. You could say from a Christian tradition, like Father as container, Son as the manifest, and Holy Ghost, Spirit as the dynamics, for example. But you see this across all traditions. So this eco-intention process, as in my through my lenses and my understanding, is a way of working consciously with this dynamic as a whole. As a nice image of this kind of toroidal process, and then noticing that as the information flows between these different subtle layers into the gross and the manifest, that it passes through these 5 platonic solids, which, as you all know, make up all of our physical reality. And that Buckminster Fuller's jitterbug here describe, when I saw this presented to me in one of our wisdom school webinars, I was, okay, there we go. That is the kind of cosmos breathing, as it were. That is the breathing process, because it cycles through all these different platonic solids. So that's the geometry of the torus, as I understand it. You can look at the torus in this flow form, but you could also see it through these geometric lenses of the jitterbug, and that's basically what we're working with. So how does it actually work, this eco-intention practice? Well, as I said, what's really important is that you define the boundary of the system that you're working with. This is an example of maybe a house or an organization. So you can get that from a map. You shrink the map down to a couple of inches or so, and you put it on a piece of A4 paper. And that can be, if that's a big piece of land, you're basically just drawing the external boundary of the system. And then you create what we call a holon, which is the kind of egg shape around it, which is like the sound box that contains the energy of the system within which it can resonate. So you create a holon, and that's how you get in touch with the information fields of the system by, it's what we call a resonator, by using this like a resonator. Like when you go to a psychic and they kind of say your name, date of birth, and you say these things, and that's their way of, that's the resonator, as it were, that enables them to get in touch with the information fields related to you. This is what we use to be able to get in touch with the information fields related to a particular entity, like organization, house, whatever piece of land. Now, part of basically this work works in 2 levels. One is at a distance. So you are, and I'll describe in more detail how, but you're working with this system at a distance using different symbols, colors, anything with a particular resonance that fits the need of the system at a distance. But it is also important to actually go physically to the location, because that helps ground and bring the energy in. And what you do is you identify a number of places to check in the system to see whether the information and energy is coming into that system, and also to test a number of other parameters in person. So you can test the parameters by dowsing them at a distance, but you can also test them on the ground, and that is important because it just helps to bring it all down. These are what we call control points in the system. So yeah, so it was you know, different views of this. In this case, I guess a house, or maybe a farm, I think, actually. So what we were really doing is, you've got let's take the house, you've got this entity itself in reality, you've got a map that acts as the resonator, and that acts as the bridge between your intention, the work you're doing with the system, and the system itself, so that they're kind of, in a way, operating all at the same level. You're tuning into the information fields of that system, and it's getting downloaded, as it were, to the system itself. What some of the core language we use around this is that when we work with the stewards and guardians of the system, they don't need to understand and believe the whole approach and things, but they do need to work consciously with their affirmations and intention, because the goals that you're trying to achieve within the year and the affirmations or intention that the guardian holds is the information that's sent to the system. And that's more, we could say, from the mind. But that's not enough. That doesn't work on its own. You need to activate that information, charge it, as it were, with your attention that comes more from the heart, that sends the life energy to the system. And it's the combination of intention and attention that creates what we call the formative force. The information and the life energy together is what generates the formative force. And when I was doing this interview with Brenda on Humanity Rising, we had an interesting reflection, which was that around the masculine and the feminine. And Brenda said, yeah, the guys seem to be very good at moving the line, let's say, in the direction they wanted it to go, but they didn't get very big results. And the women seem to get big results, but not necessarily in the direction they wanted it to go. And it's kind of, okay, so there you go. The masculine in a kind of archetype, as it were, is more around intention and sending the information. So that's the direction of the line. Whereas the feminine is more traditionally around the heart and the attention and sending life energy. So the guys were getting pretty good at sending the intention with the information, and the women were great at getting the volume of energy sent in, but weren't as good at getting the information as a tune. So I thought that was an interesting connection between this and the pair work. Yeah, so this image of life energy and information going into creation, attention and intention, essentially our intention creating a kind of blueprint in the field that is increasing the probability of something manifesting. So a little bit more about how it works. So let's say we've got this map, that we had, and I got it on a piece of A4, and you create a field, let's say, on the desk in front of you. It could be with a cloth, or you can bound it with a number of crystals or wood that has turned to stone. Those are very good grounding tools. It's important to bound the field that you put the map in, because otherwise all the energy of that system comes into your room and your house, and you really don't want it. So you have to be very clear about creating the space within which you're going to work. And then you put the piece of paper which has the map on it, or the name of the project on it, your resonator essentially, in that space. You turn it until you feel it click in. It's what we call a critical rotation point. You turn it, you feel it click, and it's like an antenna on an old TV You know, when the picture's fuzzy, you twist the antenna till the picture becomes clear. Well, that's kind of how it feels. You're turning the paper, you feel it click in. And then what you're doing is, you know, you, through your attention, you connect to that resonator, you tune into the field of the system. And the way we access that information is through dowsing, generally with a pendulum. Obviously, there are different ways people pick up information, can be muscle testing. Some people just know it. But the reason that we use the dowsing like that is so that there is a shared practice amongst the practitioners, and that you can actually track each other doing it as well. So sometimes somebody will be dowsing with their pendulum, and others will be able to feel along with it and, you know, see when the pendulum moves as they get to a certain level. So what you do at the beginning is you do a kind of intake test, where we have a number of different parameters that we're testing. And I just want to see if, yeah, okay. So I might have them later, but I should have put them in at this stage. But just so you know, the parameters that we're testing in terms of the energetic coherence, vitality of the system are: one, how grounded it is. They're kind of reflected here in a way, how grounded it is, how much orgone, so life energy, we use the Reichian terms, how much life energy the system has, how much orgone, how much Uranor, stressed energy, is in the system, or Dor, those three kind of Reichian terms, which is dead orgone, essentially blocked, dead Uranor, blocked energy, so the stressed energy as it congeals into blocked energy. And we have a parameter we call the percentage of organization and adaptation, POA, POA, and that's essentially the ability of the system to self-organize, so to not need external guidance or impetus, but to have all the information it needs for it to be able to self-organize to achieve its goal. So we test those parameters, and they're either kind of with the Bovie scale as well. We test the Bovie of the system, and if you're familiar with it, you'll know that around 6,000 to 8,000 is the kind of healthy range for a human system. Below that means it's kind of sick or draining energy. Above that means that there are too many great ideas or visions that aren't grounded enough in reality, which means that the people in the system tend to burn out, because there's all these great ideas and lots of things we could do, but there's no way to actually turn them into reality. And often when you're balancing a project, when we do this initial test, you find, particularly nowadays, very high bovies. And so part of what happens over that 8 months is that you're bringing the bovies down, and you're increasing the POA. So they go kind of hand in hand. It's like if you've got a great vision about something, then but you haven't got the ability to manifest it, then your percentage of organization and adaptation, in other words, the ability for the system to self-organize, is low, because it's not able to deal with all of this information that's coming in. So those grow towards each other. So you do this initial scan that basically gives you a picture of all those parameters, to see where the system is now in the context of what it wants to achieve within a year. And then you dowse, what does the system want now to help it take its next step? And nearly always, for the first couple of months, it's grounding, because you can't do anything else with the system until it's grounded enough to be able to receive it. And until the grounding is at least 60% in the system, there's no point in even trying anything else. So normally you've got a very high bovies, lots of vision and excitement, and very little grounding. So the first phase of balancing is nearly always grounding. And there are for each of these different interventions, there are different symbols and things that they've discovered over the years that have a different effect. And the Tzadeh from the Hebrewic alphabet is one of the most effective ones, interestingly enough, for grounding. And so you're dowsing, okay, what does the system need? Grounding, okay. And then you go, okay, these are the different options we have in terms of symbols and things, which of these fits best? You dowse to find the one that the system fits best. And then you ask how many days a week does it need this intervention? And normally it's around 5 or so. And how many minutes each time you dowse? And normally it's around 2 minutes. So that would mean that for 2 minutes, 5 days a week, you would put your bit of paper with the symbol on into its critical rotation point in your field. You would take this SADE symbol, you put it on top of the resonator, and you turn it as well until it clicks into its critical rotation point. And then you let the two talk to each other for 2 minutes. You don't do anything else. You back out, basically, and you hold the space for the information to move between the symbol and the information field of the system you're balancing through its resonator. So grounding is one. It may be that the system is short on energy, on orgone, and it requests an input of energy. So we created our own, or Hans built orgone beamers that you would use to add extra energy to the system. What you can also use, if people are familiar with the orgone beamers, if you do it in reverse, if you like, one end energy comes in, the other end energy goes out. If you turn it around, you can actually use it to extract blocked and stressed energy from the system if you put a certain symbol in between that kind of round panel, as it were, that you put on the resonator and the resonator itself. So it actually transforms blocked and stressed energy as well. Yeah, so the transformers are things that open up or transform the blocked and stressed energy. Informers, basically, which are often colors, give the system access to information fields that it doesn't currently have access to. So an example would be if you had, for example, an extreme drought in an area where the trees weren't used to having to go deeper to look for water, then they might need the information that that's what they have to do to be able to solve their problem. So you would use an informer to put on the system to help it access the information fields that it needs to be able to achieve its purpose, solve the problem that it's currently facing. And the harmonizers are for shifting the stressed and blocked energy. In particular, the WAF, that symbol on the left down there, is particularly effective for that. And we have encountered, a number of different crop circles over the years that also have different effects. So basically, you've got a set of parameters that you're using to assess the energetic vitality of the system. You normally every 10 days or so, you check up on it again. You ask, okay, you check the values. Where are you now? Values go into a spreadsheet. You can see the progress. You can show the progress to the guardian, the steward that you're working with. And you ask the system, what intervention does it need next to take the next step? You do that over the next 10 days or so, then you check up again. And that process lasts for about 8 months. And usually the interventions become less. In fact, what's interesting is over the years, we have found that less is more. That whereas a lot of these, we used to be doing things almost every week. What we found now is when you actually get the grounding in place, then the system tends to look after itself. Occasionally, you might need to extract some particular block to stressed energy. It might need a little informing here and there. But the level of intervention we found over the years has been less. Interesting development. So here's like how it would work, for example, with the orgone beamer, and I think this is for extracting some blocked or stressed energy because it's got that symbol in between. So there's they put out their cloth that creates the field. The orgone beamer is on a symbol. That transforms the energy as it's extracted from the system. And there's that form on the left is where all the data is recorded as you go through and dowse. And as you'll know, Brenda and Bob often write in their books, when you're accessing information with that level of consciousness, you can't engage the rational mind to analyze it as well. So what you do is you're dowsing and you just stick all the numbers down, and you don't stop to think about it until you finish getting the information. You log the information, you kind of check out of the system, as it were, and then you can look at it and think, okay, what's the story it's telling now in terms of where the system is at and what it needs, and how you're going to communicate it to the guardian in a way at your next meeting, whether you would share what you're seeing energetically, they'll tell you the story of what's going on the ground. And often there's some really nice connections there. There's another example of a floor plan with the different control points, where you go in and actually measure the energy on the spot. This is what one of the charts looks like as you go through your different tests. So you can see on the right the target values of the system. What we have found over the, and they found over the 20 years of this work, is that the levels of Dor and Ordinor, so blocked and stressed energy in systems, have really increased. We generally don't, once it gets to minus 1500, we don't bother measuring anymore because it's not very pleasant to go there. You just kind of go, okay, minus 1500 plus, and then you keep testing it until it surfaces, as it were, above that minus 1500 level. So you can see there that it took a little while. This was around minus 1300 for the energy to appear from wherever it had come from, with these negative values of Dor and Ordinor. And then often interesting things happen when you're balancing the projects, when the grounding kind of line crosses one of the other lines, and things happen in the projects. Suddenly, I don't know, something comes through that they'd been waiting on for a long time, but you see synchronicities between the coherence of the values, how they relate to each other, and with what actually happens on the ground. The usefulness of having a chart like this and kind of putting it into Excel and a spreadsheet is that, one, it actually helps ground the project and the energies and the values. Two, it gives you something to talk to the steward or the guardian with, which is something they would recognize. Oh, lines on a chart. Okay. And then you can use it to tell the story in a way of what's going on in the project. So one of the kind of key elements of this that I found particularly interesting, that I just wanted to leave you with as well, is when we're working in the forests, for example, on this, part of what you do in the training, in this 4-year training, is you learn to feel the radiance of the energy off the trees. And there are 3 layers that are easy to feel. They have all slightly different qualities to them. But the 3rd layer, when the tree is healthy, is kind of at the boundaries of the canopy of the tree. So if you kind of test for where the 3rd layer is, and you look up and you see it's in line with the canopy, then the tree is generally healthy. In the springtime, often the field is a bit further out than the canopy, and in the autumn it's often a bit further in, as the tree kind of pulls its energy in, as it were. But when you're balancing a forest as a whole, what you're looking for is overlap between the radiance of the different trees, because that creates a coherent ecosystem that prevents other kind of foreign entities coming in, or species coming in, disturbing the ecosystem. So what you find is, when it's energetically healthy and you've got radiant trees, they create a coherence in the system where it naturally kind of looks after and protects itself. Whereas if the trees are stressed for whatever reason, climate change, electrosmog, whatever it might be, and their fields kind of contract, then you find that foreign species get in, the ecosystem starts to degrade. And they've done this work more in the kind of environmental context. And I found it's a nice image also for organizations, because when you've got a coherent field in an organization, you have overlapping fields of the people. They're kind of moving and working together as a flock of birds would, in a way. The moment that they're under stress and that they contract, then you get all sorts of weird stuff going in. People kind of fall back on their egos. and you get lots of conflict in the system. So we found when you balance things and the system is coherent energetically, then you get the organization self-organizing. You get a lot of synchronicities and a lot of flow in the system, and things happen with a lot less effort than they normally would. So I'm going to leave it there, and then we can have some questions and go into more detail in some of it if you're interested. Just to correct one thing that Jeff said early on, the Why workbook is actually about work that would support people and planet, kind of focused on local economies. And the new book, Leading from the Field, has 12 principles for stewards of a system. So people who are accountable running an organization to be able to keep those energy information fields coherent. So part of what also changed when Reich and Hans left the German woman in her tower was that they realized you can get, anybody can get the energy values to a certain level. But then when you walk away, if there's nobody on the ground who's curating it, they just deflate again like a balloon. And you've got to have the steward on the ground maintaining their affirmations and their intention to be able to keep the values, you know, where you want them to be. And so what Leading from the Field does is describe 12 principles that help somebody to do that in a way that, again, is hopefully simple and easy and doesn't sound strange. And then the other thing, just to let you know, as probably many of you have heard, is that we've transported the Pear Lab, or it's been shipped from Princeton now over to Yorkshire in the UK to this beautiful estate at Broughton. The idea being to create what we're calling the weird experience, weird being the Anglo-Saxon term for the interconnectedness of everything, where people can actually walk in and get a direct experience of how their mind influences the world around them. And we're launching that at this event in November called Science and Consciousness. Yes, Murphy, there he is, starting to looking a little naked. But we're working very hard to put him back together again, and along with a number of the other items that were shipped across. So we'll leave it there for now. I'm happy to go into more details with any questions you might have.
Thank you, Peter. It's a fascinating talk, and I'll actually kick things off with a question. And I apologize for the sort of the ill-formed nature of this, but it was something that just kept floating through my mind as you were talking. Can you talk at all about the role of animals in all of this? You know, whether they're at whatever level, from insect through, and I don't mean humans, but more. You know, whether it's cats and dogs kinds of animals, or deer and forest creatures, or have you looked at that? How does that play into all of this?
Well, when certainly in the balancing that they've done in natural environments, parklands and things, the biodiversity has always increased. And quite often species that used to be there and then left return. That's one of the other kind of things they found. So you certainly get a response from the animals. And like I said, on the farms, you find the animals being a lot healthier and needing a lot less intervention. I don't know in terms of households like cats and dogs and things, but certainly in the kind of ecosystems, the diversity increases, species return, and on farms, you get a lot more health of the animals. Yeah.
Yeah, interesting. I apologize, and in my eagerness to ask the question, I forgot to let people know. If you have questions, feel free to turn on your cameras. I'll be keeping an eye out for hands that are raised either visibly on cameras, or if you want to digitally raise your hand like Mark has, then do that, and I'll try to keep these in the proper order, and then sort of call on people in that order. So Mark, why don't you go ahead? And you're muted.
So this is so cool for me to hear this. And I've been kind of living this, you know, but to have like a scientific explanation, and to see that there is a scientific explanation for this stuff is just awesome. But anyway, so my question though, one thing I didn't hear you talk about, because I run an organization, a manufacturing organization, and my goal has been for years to run it energetically. And I actually don't live in the same state anymore as my organization, which oddly enough seems to have actually helped the organization. But one thing I didn't hear you talk about though is, like in my case, we have customers and we make products for them, and then we've got lots of vendors that we're buying stuff from. And so one thing I've felt like is really important. And by the way, too, before I go into that, is, initially I used to think like I was never really worried about profits, but I was worried about cash flow, because cash flow is like the lifeblood of a business. And that was my number one focus. And then later on, I realized that no, my number one focus needs to be the energy of the organization. And I started doing that. And a side effect of that was how my organization is interacting with all of my vendors, with my employees, and my customers. And so a very important critical intention for me has been that the energy exchange between my vendors and my customers is always positive, or as positive as can possibly be. So like in the case of my customers, I want to be their favorite place to do business. And in the case of my vendors, I want to be their favorite customer. And I have found that doing that really just helps the organization be healthy. And also it just really helps the organization to be able to get what it needs when it needs, and so I get special understanding or special favors from customers, or special understanding, special favors, special circumstances, coincidences, and stuff with my vendors. But anyway, so I'd like to hear your comments about, the organizations, because I know like you're talking about like a nature plot, and of course that's going to have some stuff coming and going, especially like if you've got a river going through that area or something like that, you'll have things coming and going through it. But typically, like, a nature plot though typically doesn't have a lot coming and going. It's usually kind of a self-sustaining sort of thing, aside from, water and sunlight. But anyway, I'd like to hear what you have to say about that.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. Yeah. Well, what we have found when working with organizations is certainly it increases productivity. And the part of what I left out, because, wait and see if it came up really, but I will share it now, is this idea of these different levels of the system. So we balance the system on 3 different levels, what we call concept, contact, and realization level. And the concept level is where the visions and plans happen. The realization level is the workflow where things get done. And the middle level is where the communication happens. And this is like really important for internal communication, but also external communication with clients and suppliers and things like that. So often, the concept level in terms of the way we the order in which we do this, the concept level leads, it's your vision and your plans. You then have to turn it in, realize something before you start to go out and communicate. What we often find is that people have all these great visions. They haven't actually realized anything or grounded it in any way. And then the communication just kind of floats off. So to be able to give it body, we need to have manifested something at the realization level, and then the communication level can start to flow. So we check those energetic values that I mentioned to you at all 3 of these levels. So for an organization, it's really important that obviously at the contact level, the middle level communication, that the values are also strong, because that's the relationship with the outside world. But those tend to kind of shape up, as it were, once the visions have at least there's been a prototype of the vision. You see what I mean? Once it's really been turned into something in the material world, it's like it then has body or resonance to communicate externally. So yeah, that, yes, in organizations, it seems to help financially, with productivity, with relationships with suppliers and clients. The communication lines clear up where there has often been like noise on the line, as it were. And as I say, it's not, so I always kind of remind people, it's not, you can't do the energetic work in isolation. Like as you're doing the energetic work, you need to also be working at the relational level and at the material level, improving the systems and processes, you know, improving the relationships between people. But doing that work happens with far more grace and far less effort when you're doing the energetic work in parallel. So I don't do any organizational development work now without doing the energetic work as well, or else it's just a waste of, you know, energy and far less effective.
Vasilius, go ahead.
Hi.
Hey.
Hi, and thanks for the talk. And congratulations for your accession to the board. My question is about your scheme of self-organization and I would say governance of in the, you know, in the good sense, not in the old hierarchical thing of complex systems. And I this is something that I care a lot here. I mean, in Belgium, I'm living in Belgium, and so we're kind of neighbors. In the Flemish part, we have made a cooperative that based on the principles of complex systems, with a guy who is a beekeeper and a farmer. I mean, turned beekeeper and farmer, and he has established a kind of. I mean, we have established a kind of complex cooperative around his activities, honey making, bread making, and all that. The problem is that we did not have any clear directions of how to govern such a complex entity, not based in values like monetary values or, you know, profit. And so there was always a tendency of subgroups of this community to slip to measuring success or their work or their engagement by their personal benefit in terms of, you know, monetary value or some. So there's always a constant struggle. And I was wondering if there is a way to somehow govern this this process of slipping back to old habits.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there are, Vasilius, and that becomes a whole organizational consulting session then. But it, you know, if I was to kind of take the eco-intention perspective on it, what it suggests to me is that the information that the system needs to be able to govern itself is not yet in the system. And so if we were balancing the project, I'd expect at some point, well, first the grounding might just do it itself, but the use of what we call an informator that kind of plugs the system into a field where it would get the answers it needs, so download, as it was like that, you know, the thing on the Matrix where she gets into the helicopter and she just downloads the program of how to fly the helicopter. It's kind of like that, you know, download the program of what the appropriate governance system is for what you're trying to achieve, because that's the key. I mean, I always see an organization like an organism that exists in an ecosystem. And so what does it, for it to be able to achieve its goal in the context within which it's in, what's the most appropriate governance system? And so doing the kind of energetic work in parallel, you know, what you can start doing, and I think you've seen the Leading from the Field book, right, is practicing as a leadership team the intentionality around, you know, the goals that you want to achieve with each other, and turning those into affirmations. What you're doing then is you're uploading the information into the field about what it is you're wanting to achieve. You're feeling what that would be like if you did, which is the life energy, the attention through the heart, and then pay attention to what comes your way in terms of the solutions that you need to solve the problems that you're facing. You know, and you can do that in a way that these two elements to the eco-intention work, right? One is the stewards themselves learning to steward their system energetically, without necessarily any external intervention. And the other part is the eco-intention practitioner who does this kind of work at a distance and coaches the stewards and things. But you can start already, you know, working intentionally with the goals you want to achieve. And then that would pull towards you the solutions that you need for the system. I mean, I could give you lots of examples of governance operating systems that could support you doing that. And I'm happy to do that on another call if you want,
Sure,
at some point, and talk through that. But from the informational point of view, like holding the intention clear about what it is you want to achieve with each other, the core values that you have, creating that field. It's like, you know, the field reg work. When you have a shared purpose and shared values, you get that coherence in the field itself amongst yourselves. Once you've got that, you know, you'll create that kind of dent in the kind of gravity well that will pull the things towards you that you need to solve the problems you're facing.
Well, I'll be happy to continue like that with the other guys of the community, of this community. The thing is that it was conceived. I mean, I was also kind of thinking that to have a kind of a steering team, or as you say, like the stewardships. And it was conceived from the other members as an kind of superimposed hierarchical structure. And it was exactly these members that they took the money and the money and go. So it's kind of anyway. It's yeah.
Right. That's, you remember the example of the trees overlapping or not overlapping. Like the trees aren't overlapping in your system, so there isn't a coherence in the collective field.
Yeah. So that's true.
And you're kind of getting this contraction where individuals are looking after themselves, and where the entity as a whole isn't at the center. That's the key. The question is, what do we need to do to be in service of this entity that has created itself through us, right? Rather than we created the entity. This entity created itself through us. How can we best be of service to it? Then it becomes a completely different conversation, right? When the organization is at the center and the people are there to serve it, rather than the kind of, you know, the individual centered approach. And yeah, what you described, I immediately kind of light up in my spiral dynamics value systems map, and could probably give you a few insights into what's going on there in the dynamics, but that would take us down a different rabbit hole for now.
Brendan, yeah. Go ahead.
Peter, I love the description you've given, and I love your system. And as you were representing it, I found that what you were describing was the dynamic and the entity that was pair. I don't know that we were doing all of that consciously, but we were doing it. And it worked. And because of that, I find that the connection of pair in its future is with you and Broughton is so exciting, because clearly that was intended to be its future. So I thank you for that. And I thank you for clarifying. I think it may be well that I didn't understand the full systemic picture that you drew at the time, because I think it might have been a distraction. But Bob and I were doing exactly what you described, but doing it intuitively.
Exactly.
So.
Yeah. Well, we can only really put labels and maps and theories on these things after we've discovered them intuitively, as it were, first. Then it's, oh, what are we doing? Oh, that's what we're doing. Yeah.
Yeah, that's what we were doing.
Yeah, right.
For that.
Right. Yeah, I think Betty's got her hand up.
Yep, Betty, you're muted.
Hi, I'm Betty Woodman, and I have the sense that many of you know each other here.
Oh, we may have just...
Time.
Oh, there you go. Okay.
Yeah. Oh, was I not there?
Oh, you froze for just a moment. That's it.
Oh, okay. Yeah. And I know Brenda's name. I don't know if she would remember me, but we had sort of corresponded a few times over the years. But this is fascinating. I can't help but be very excited about your work on a lot of levels. But the number one thing that's coming through to me is how much we need this on a real widespread basis. And I'm so fascinated by your work with organizations. And sort of in this practical sense, I had some questions that just came right to mind, which were number one, sort of when you were working with IBM, I get the sense, or when you work with companies in general, you're sort of working as a well-integrated consultant, I'd say, with probably some key people in the organization. That's the way I'm sensing that that's happening. And I'm wondering, like how much uptake there is of this, how many companies are doing this now, and how many people are facilitating and doing this kind of work that you're doing. Mm. And sort of what is it that, how do you find the people that you're working with? And how do you have a conversation that helps people understand what it is you're doing enough that they are willing to take that next step and engage with you to do that? And then how do you sort of translate, when you're working with people who may not have the same level of background or understanding of any of this? And the reason I have lots of questions, but those in particular, because I just really think that there are so many places that we really need this. I mean, I sit in the United States today, and I know we have things all over the world. There are so many ways that we could be working with systems and organizations. So I'm just wondering if you had any comments about that.
Yeah. Well, it may be useful just to sketch how it goes over the 4 years, because in the first year of the eco-intention training, you're basically learning the concepts and you're learning to trust your own readings of energy. You're learning to work with the trees and things like that, and you're not touching the energy field of any system. In the second year, you balance your own home and garden, so to make sure that and if you're self-employed, your own business, so you apply it to yourself, as it were, first, and that's your first experience of learning with it. Now, in the third and fourth years, you work with other people's projects. So that can be a piece of land, that can be somebody else's organization. And part of the learning there is precisely what you said, is how do you learn to sell it? Because they have to pay for it as well, And so you've got to convince them to part with some money to be able to go through this process that, isn't kind of the normal process. And there are now, I think, about 200 eco-intention practitioners, so graduates who've come through the whole program over the years. A lot of them, some integrate it into their existing consulting. Some people only do that work. And they're not all just balancing Steiner schools, they are balancing kind of like my third year, I worked on a 5,000 hectare estate here in the Netherlands, So how did that work? Well, it was through the kind of national, and then in the UK, it would be the National Trust. It's like the kind of national body that looks after the woodlands and things. And it was just a bunch of synchronicities, basically, that put me in front of this guy who was responsible for this area of woodland. And it's funny that, like, the question is, what do you say, right? How do you explain it to someone? And I often kind of resort more to the kind of science side or the quantum. I'd often use, like, much gratitude to Brenda and Bob, the fact that, this is stuff that was researched for 28 years, Princeton University's engineering school, and relate to the quantum things. And basically, you don't need to understand it all, but if you're open to there being, I guess what I would normally say, if you're open to there being an aspect to reality that you don't normally see and measure, then that's what we're working with. And sometimes I'll use that light spectrum example. And the funny thing is that most people on an individual basis have had some experience of it, either through a religion or a spiritual path, or that their wife does Reiki or something, or an uncle has had this experience, or they've had some of this Rupert Sheldrake stuff, being stared at, or the phone thing, or those kind of synchronicities. So actually, a lot of people, when you get them one-on-one, are willing to accept that there is more to reality than we can see and measure, but are unwilling to kind of share that collectively. So this guy, he's kind of, well, yeah, okay, you know, and all I need to do is like have these goals and create these attentions and affirmations. Yeah, you know, and that's how he kind of started off. And then and it's just I guess because you work with this consciousness, it's just, you've just got to trust that it's the right person who's showing up at the right time. And you may not know why, or they may not seem like, you know, the right person, but if you can trust that for some reason the universe has connected the two of you to do this work, then it tends to pan out. It's funny. And it is easier to get organizations to part with their money when you link it to a more traditional organizational development or change process. So if that's also your background and whatever you're working with, whether it's Theory U or, you know, any of these processes, and you say, and by the way, you know, part of the package is bonus, you know, we do this work alongside of it, then they'll, you know, they'll tend to go with it. So a lot of what you're learning actually as a practitioner is to develop the trust in yourself to tell other people about it, to sell your work, as it were, to the other person. The moment that you're doubting it yourself, the other one starts to doubt it, right? The moment that you just show up and it's the most normal thing in the world, they'll kind of go, oh, okay. That's my experience anyway. So, and it was, you know, these are often the debates in the class. Oh, Hans, there must be a more structured way to, you know, how do you go about doing this? And it's much more about your own inner state as the practitioner that, of course, creates the resonance in the other that kind of lifts, you know, may lift them up a bit to go kind of, oh, yeah, you know, got an inkling. Okay, let's just try it, you know, and
So
the
fascinating,
authenticity
yeah.
of you as a practitioner as well.
That makes an awful lot of sense. By day, I work in a university teaching, and I work with ethics, which I sort of mapped, hopefully correctly, onto your relational architecture side of things. But I also have personal interests that go into the energetic, and I do some energy work as well with Reunion, if you're familiar with that, which is more on an individual level. I come from an engineering systems background, so I love systems. And this is just so much more than, I think, it kind of pulls some of those dynamics together with that. So anyway, I'm sitting here very enthused and excited about your work. I think it's fascinating. So thank you.
And I should say most of those practitioners, you know, the 200 have come out of England, have come out of the Netherlands. But we have the last couple of years done the first trainings in English as well. So, and because of COVID, they've been online too. So, so they have started doing, if you go to like ecointention.com, I think, then they have started doing the trainings in English online now as well. Yeah.
Are there other questions that folks have? Guy, yeah.
I'm very sorry I couldn't be here from the beginning. I had to make a choice. You may be interested in what I was at that began at the very same hour. It came out of Yale, the School of Forestry, the Forum on Religion and Ecology. It was hosted by Mary Evelyn Tucker. Robin Wall Kimmerer was one of the participants, David Haskell. It had a great deal to do with the integrality, so to speak, of forest life, forest communication, and human, natural, eco-human coexistence. I'll leave it at that. They promised they're gonna make the recording and the transcript available. Some of you may be as interested as I was.
Thank you. Mark, go ahead. Nope.
You've muted, Mark.
I wanted to mention that I really liked how you talked about the system becoming self-governing. That's been weird for me because I've had firsthand experience with that, because I've created my business and then I've seen the business manipulate me and force me to do things. You know, like it needed a new space, you know, and the building was being sold that we were in, and I told the property manager, no, I don't want to move. I don't have the money for it. And then I told the new owner, no, I don't want to move. And they just kept on me. And then they said, well, we'll put you in a bigger space for the same amount of money that you're currently paying. So my cost per square foot goes down. I'm like, no, I don't have the money to handle the renovation and stuff. So then they said, well, we'll pay for the renovation. And so I'm like, okay, bigger space for the same amount of money and free renovation. And then what was kind of weird too, was like, if I had taken a blank sheet of paper and drew out what I thought would be the best layout for my next space, the space that we ended up in was better than what I would have created on my own. And then later on, I've seen a case where, like I was manipulated into getting rid of my office manager, who was my most senior person at the time, most difficult person to replace. And I was manipulated into doing that by seeing this article about offering a bonus to quit. And I'd seen it before, and then I saw it again, and it just hit me. It was just real strong. I was like, I need to do this. And the only person who quit out of over 20 employees was my office manager. That was the only person that did it. And then I got one that was actually much better than where I was, and who was ideal. And it took me like 3 years to discover how ideal. I mean, there was things I did not know about her that I did, and I did not know that my business was going to need, that were all there. But anyway, I wanted to ask you, have you thought about, as you get more of these teachers, because I know there's other groups and other modalities that are doing stuff like this, worried about the planet, but have you thought about taking your post-grads and collecting them together and having them work on just the planet overall? And as you said, you don't have to do it every day, but maybe periodically bringing those people back together and having those people channel, and especially later on as you start expanding this and you get more people in other countries, I think that that could be really powerful.
Yeah, just on the people thing, Mark, that's one of the other things that happen as the energetic values get coherent. The system tends to spin out the people who aren't best served being there, and then attract the people who do need to be there. And it's amazing. Like I just finished balancing the Broughton system, and 3 of the most perfect people have just shown up to fill the jobs that they needed there. But yeah, we're actually doing that. So Hansa's part one of what the Center for Eco Intention does is currently running a big project in Europe. So it's brought together different this is a whole nother story around it, but I think it's actually on my YouTube channel. I've got the story of Hans telling about this Europe project, but we're kind of finding the acupuncture point in the European system, that if you got things coherent there, it would have the biggest ripple effect across the rest of Europe. And we have practitioners out in Hungary and Poland and things who we've trained to actually be on the ground there in these some of the national parks actually, and are being supported at a distance, as it were, with some of the Dutch practitioners as well. So so we the center has started doing some of that work to look at how can you apply this to larger systems, because the principles are the same. I mean, it's fractal essentially. So it doesn't really matter how big the system is. In fact, the problem is if systems are too small, because there isn't like enough space for enough diversity, as it were, for the dynamics to unfold more. So if it's that's why we look for these bigger areas of land, because somehow the system is able to self-organize and find the solutions more effectively if it's got that diversity.
Jody, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, yes. I had a few questions. One of them was specific to the micro quantum level across space and time in your torus model. In regard to global entanglement and being receptive to the fact that there are no limits between the energy fields and the individual, and that is inclusive of the earth. And all the research right now coming out internationally is very focused on that micro quantum level and the interrelationships of mindfulness and tension that can help support a global well-being across entities, across fields, because of the fields can be directly influenced by perceptions and intention. So if you could speak about that, that would be I would be very interested to hear your view on that.
I'm not sure I fully understand, Jody, what you're asking. I will give an example of you mentioned the time thing. So we've also played with that, where we, for example, one of the things you do in the training is you identify a tree, let's say in the park where we're doing the training, and you in the morning, let's say we have a photo of the tree, and we would give it a balancing. So we would send a certain energy to that tree, but we'd set it for a time in the future. So let's say 2 p.m. in the afternoon. And then we'd all go out to the tree at 2 p.m. in the afternoon, and you feel the radiance levels of the tree, and you're standing there in a circle basically around this outer field, and at 2 o'clock, you just can't deny it physically. There's this like whoosh as the kind of field expands, and it rocks the whole circle back. Like you couldn't have coordinated it at exactly the same time. And so in terms of this ability to send information, as it were, through time in that way, that's something, you know, that we work with a lot. And if you've missed the balancing, like because for whatever reason, you know, you can go back in time to have the information land at that time, or you can balance forward into the future. It's harder. We encourage people to do more the future work than the past work, because in the past, the patterns are more ingrained, as it were. So it's harder, but in the future, they're not yet formed. So it's easier to balance into the future than it is into the past. But I'm not sure if that was really what you were pointing to. I'm afraid I didn't quite understand. Maybe if somebody else did, they can.
Okay. Well, what I think I can clarify, I will think of a drop in a puddle as your seed, and the wave that is created by that. And the fact that if your intention, or a global intention, especially in regard to, let's say, global warming, and working together as a unity to focus on mindful practices that are on healing of the earth, or of these interconnections, and recognizing that we're interconnected, and the fact that it's limitless, and as you had mentioned, related to time, as well as those fields and a level of consciousness can be tapped into as well.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, yes, of course, and Roger would kind of obviously be able to tell us a lot more about that with the Global Consciousness Project and the work he's doing around that. But the thing is that yes, it's limitless in terms of what we can choose to do. And they got Lynn McTaggart with the intention experiments, you know, who's been doing that for a number of years. But at the same time, we're not the only ones intending stuff, as it were. There's all sorts of other forces pulling on it as well. So we certainly, you know, I think we certainly can make an impact at that larger scale. And at the same time, there's a kind of level of humility that the bigger it gets, I guess, the more other forces there are kind of pulling on it as well. That's one of what we found is working with when the system is bounded in space and time in terms of it's named and it's got a purpose, and you've got somebody or a team who's accountable for it in the end, and that team is aligned with the vision and willing to do the work with you, that's what increases the probability of having the greatest possible impact, because you've got a container in a way within which the information can come into and do its work. If it's too vague or not defined enough, it's like removing the banks of the river. You know, it just got to go, and you don't get any flow or movement. in it. So I think that's maybe one of the ways to think about it, is how defined or bounded is it, and does that influence the ability for the information to be able to come into kind of material world or material form. Anybody else want to jump in on that point?
I have a question that occurred to me from a couple of comments ago, but I'm not sure I could trace it back exactly. You obviously work with Ubiquity University, but it strikes me that the ideas that underlie what you just were talking about were things that I think would be, in some sense, easier to communicate to younger than university-aged people. Is there a piece of this that that could somehow get folded into education for little kids, or is there something there? I guess. What's your sense?
I think, yeah, but more not so in the conceptual level, but the experiential level. So I have the mind lamp sitting on my table here, and it's just gone a very bright green as I said that. And the kids, before they were teenagers, they could just walk in. They got bored of it. It was so easy, oh, I made the lamp go red, red, or I've done kind of some. So at that level, I think doing it experientially with them, so that they actually get the experience of, oh yeah, my mind connects to that thing, and I don't actually have a physical connection to it. Obviously, it's going to do something, psychoactive at some level. I have done some stuff. Sorry?
That's definitely been my sense.
Yeah. I have done some stuff in secondary schools, more around the kind of remote perception stuff, but then with the cards, with the symbols, so someone's got a card with a symbol and the other person needs to try to read it. And we get, quite significant hits. And the nice thing about it is that, and I tell them a little bit of the story, but I try to kind of simplify it in a way, and relate it to sometimes to Harry Potter and things like that. I dare say it. And but they kind of think it's cool. Oh wow, this person was holding a card with a triangle and I drew a triangle without even knowing it. That's cool. And we don't do a big kind of theoretical debrief on it, but the fact that they've had that experience must do something to their perception, or at least plant a question in there about the nature of reality as it's described by everybody else in the educational system to them.
Yeah. I think it seems like there's implications that I don't know exactly if kids at that level would be able to get them, but that talk to taking responsibility for oneself and for one's environment, and kind of shifting maybe away a little bit, at least from the culture of gimme, just how can I use the system to get the most for me, to how can I live in a way that's a little more honorable or honor driven. Anyway, yeah, it's I don't want to take us too far afield from
I mean, for me, it's just about creating a little bit of mystery,
yeah.
Still for kids in a world that's kind of nailed down in certainty. To go, actually, we don't really know how to explain this, but it does happen like that. And it's kind of, oh, yeah. And that's kind of that there are things, to have kids realize there are things that we can't actually, explain everything. There is still some mystery in the world.
Right.
There were a couple of questions in the chat, Jeff, if I can jump to those. Betty was asking about constellations, energetic constellations work. Yeah, these can, the eco-intention process has an arc, obviously, of 8 months and then 3 months. Within that process, one-off interventions can help. So, for example, with Broughton, which has been in the family for 1,000 years, there's all sorts of inherited stuff that the current steward is carrying, and he is actually doing a family constellations process at the moment to help kind of release some of that blocked energy. So yeah, different interventions, or people are saying, well, what's the role of kind of removing entities? Sure, if you come across an entity somewhere and it might reveal itself because of the balancing work, then go in there and remove it. So one-off interventions, you know, of course, can enhance the process. Great question, Mark. What's a good place to get mind lamps now? Well, here's the breaking news. So obviously Celeron is not doing it anymore, but together with, is he on the call now? With, has he dropped off? With Wolf, who I think has dropped off, and a designer in the UK, and with John's Valentino's blessing around the IP and stuff, we're going to start making them again, but they're likely to be, this is a little unveil, they're likely not necessary to look like the original lamp. We're actually thinking of some kind of maybe human shape where the heart lights up and then the light spreads throughout the system. And we're thinking of a collective one for groups when, you know, to track their group coherence. Where, for example, imagine you had lots of these individuals and then a big heart in the middle, and as the coherence increased, the kind of light spreads around the individuals, and then the big heart at the middle starts to glow, or something like that. So, so we're kind of working on that at the moment. My mind lamp like that idea. So, so yeah, that's coming. Not yet. It's going to be a couple of years. Probably we'll run it through through a Kickstarter campaign, is what we're thinking at the moment. But you will be sure to hear about it once we get going. Yeah.
Jody, did you have a follow-up question?
Yes, the trees in, I think it's Panda, Utah. Are you familiar with, if you stand within them and go 6 inches underground, you can see the roots and how each tree is interconnected with each other. And that kind of goes to my point about that interconnectedness in the fields at the micro quantum level. So
yeah, absolutely. You know, and at the level I was talking about, it's more about when you've got this, when you've got the radiance is overlapping, you're getting an exchange of information. That means that information is flowing across the ecosystem at that level between the trees. When they contract, they're kind of left to themselves, and that enables other species, alien, you know, foreign species, to come in and start to disrupt the balance of the ecosystem. But yeah, of course, underground, they're really interconnected at that level. Yeah.
Do you see that overlap with people inside of the organization? Do you try to manage that as well?
Yeah, I mean, that's what that's kind of the relational level, but that's, I think, the parallel is, you know, when we find when the energetic values, when we've hit the target values, you get much more coherence across the system as a whole. The image I have then is actually that their fields are overlapping, as it were. Their radiance, the individual's radiance, is overlapping. So, which is why they start to move with such coherence, like the kind of flock of birds image, in a way, rather than all kind of scattered with their attention and their work. That in a way, it's like the organization is moving the people, you know, to help it serve its purpose, but in a you know, in a self, and what looks like very effective self-organization, essentially.
You should go into like work with sports teams and stuff, because I've seen that, like when you, like a sports team, like when, like, you know, they just seem to just synchronize just incredibly well and just, you know, pull off like a miracle event. And you could teach the teams, you know, to basically do that on a regular basis.
Oh, I know, Mark, it's one of the things on my list. I'm after Manchester United. But that's a big one to get. But actually, one of the projects one of the students did at Eco Intention was a rugby team in Ireland. And yeah, once they'd kind of been balanced, they had an unbeaten season. So yeah, so it has been tried, yeah. And I'm sure it would work, you know. But it is when you've got a big system like a club behind it, it's what do you actually, again, the boundaries of the system, what are you actually balancing? You're balancing the squad of 25 players or so, or are you balancing the club with their directors and the coach and the managers? You know, are the fans included in the system? So being clear on, you know, what it is that you're actually balancing is is really important. Otherwise you end up, otherwise it just dissipates, as it were.
Brenda, and then Vasilios, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to speak to that, Peter, as an example, using PAIR once again. But, PAIR was more than just Bob and me. We had a staff. It was a fantastic staff. Roger, of course, was a part of it. In fact, he was probably the first member to join. But I used to comment, the people that were part of the PAIR staff came from a broad range of backgrounds and disciplines and interests. But we worked together. We were in a very small space. Talk about defining your space. Being down in the basement helped. But when a problem came up, very often each of the members of the group would contribute what they had to offer. And the result was amazing. I used to refer to it like watching an Indy 500 pit crew. Somehow or other, a problem that seemed intractable would suddenly be resolved miraculously. And on the other hand, when there was tension among the members of the group, things tended to get out of sorts and go off track. So that really is very important.
Yeah.
And if I might mention one other thing that Jeff mentioned about, education and, trying to persuade people. I have also found that there is no way you can persuade anybody by rolling out a bunch of data and statistics. The only way you can really make a difference is when you give people permission to admit that they've had an experience of their own and somehow are able to validate it. Then poof. But you can't convince anyone with logic or statistics. Yeah, it helps to have a Princeton logo, but that was necessary but not sufficient.
As part of the, I don't know if you listened, there was a Humanity Rising session I did with Professor Chris Rowe, who runs the parapsychology department at Northampton University, and a couple of other guys. And they were talking about research they did where vast majority of people, when you got them one-on-one, would admit that they'd had some kind of unexplainable experience like that, but they didn't dare tell anybody for fear of being, thought crazy. But it is actually very widespread, which shouldn't surprise us because it's just part of the way things work, right?
Whenever we gave a talk somewhere, inevitably after we were finished and most of the people had left the room, somebody would come up and they'd look around and say, I haven't told too many people this, but I had an experience once. Yeah. And it's amazing. People really want, it isn't so much validation as it is permission. And somehow or other that logo, that Princeton whatever, seems to authenticate and validate the permission. That's not where it's at, but it helps.
Yeah.
Vasilios?
Yes. Brenda gave me impetus to say that in the Galileo Commission, where there are scientists and affiliates that they try to put forth a non-materialistic approach to science, we always have this joke originated by Sheldrake that it is, which is not a joke, it's actually, I think it's a reality, that in our times, the scientific community, at least that I can talk about, is that they are in the same situation like the gay and lesbian community was in the 50s, in the 60s, that they want to get out of the closet, they want to express themselves, and the establishments around are not ready yet for that, but still there's this pressure, I want to be free, I want to break free, like Mercury would say. So yes, there is this, I think that there's a shift of global consciousness, so to speak, in this liberation movement for science. And the other thing I wanted to just mention is that there's a very nice we can say model or analog, which is called the mycelium. The mycelium is all this network under the trees, and it's fungi. It's very, very, very primitive organizations, and they're very connected to them. Some people, well, there are still mysteries about it. Again, the son of Sheldrake, of Rupert, Merlin, has done a very good work, and he has published a book which is a bestseller. But this mycelium is what Emilios Buratinos is describing in his book, the polycentric organization, where which is a network of networks. Again, the Galileo Commission is inspired by this approach, the polycentric. So it is a magic of networks that happens, and a lot of synchronicity. I have experienced myself many times working with this Galileo thing, and it is just miraculous. Synchronicities are, as Brenda said, allowed to happen once you prepare the boundary conditions. Exactly like in the mycelium, when you have the boundary conditions, the mycelium ready, the mycelium will show incredible resilience, growth, and sustainability. So maybe we can put mycelium as also part of the vocabulary. Anyway. I shut up, sorry.
No, absolutely. Yeah.
Well, in the spirit of what we had discussed before the session started, of having an ongoing conversation afterwards, I think there's we may just give that a try. But let me take a moment and sort of bring the official meetup to a conclusion. I do want to share my screen briefly, if that's all right, just to let everybody know what's coming up. So I believe that our next meetup will be most likely on October 23rd with this Dunn guy who's going to be talking about language and its role in a lot of the things that we've been discussing here. And I think it will go a little bit further than that, but the core of it will be about communication and how that interplays with these topics. If there are other ideas for meetup sessions, we're always interested. Please do forward those on to us. And we do hope that if you enjoyed this, if you got something out of it, you'll consider making a donation. We really do appreciate all of the donations that we get, and we don't want you to feel that you need to send, $30 or $50 or something for this to be meaningful. Even $1 or $2 does help. So we very much appreciate any of those contributions you can make. But at sort of the note on the bottom there, just as a reminder for all of us, myself, everybody included, that each day is an opportunity, and it's an opportunity to add a little bit of goodness into the world around you. And if you don't find that time to laugh or to try to enjoy yourself a little bit, well, you won't, and that's a shame, because you only get so many days, and you want to make use of every single one of them. So with that, I will stop this recording if I can find my stop recording button. Oops, that's my stop video button. It tells you what kind of day I'm having. All right, here we go.